Thanks very much, and yeah, it's a great honour to be here. The Gates Foundation, as probably many of you know, love data and measurement, but we recognise that social norms are very hard to measure. So our commitment today is part of this global effort to strengthen the evidence base of what's working and why. And so there are three things that we're doing. One is with Tostan. Why does Tostan achieve such great results? We're supporting their monitoring, learning and evaluation program to enable them to measure better their holistic impact. What are the economic consequences of child marriage? Together with CEF, as Michael Anderson said earlier, we're supporting ICRW and the World Bank to generate better analysis of advocates make the case at the highest levels. And finally, in terms of thinking holistically, two of our focus areas are nutrition and maternal and reproductive health. And so we're looking in Ethiopia to improve both of these by tackling structural determinants, including early marriage. With better evidence and tools for advocacy and understanding and measuring of progress, this will help us give a better basis to make real change happen. Thanks very much.
Zander, thank you very much. I mean, one of my FID is to promote and understanding what works and how we can go about changing the practices. So we've got
et pour introduire le sujet et parler du travail qu'ils font. C'est surtout le conseiller de genre et les droits de l'homme et puis c'est non. Le micro ne marche pas, de l'interlocuteur ne marche pas. Et puis Miss Caroline Harper. Ah, excusez-moi, je ne vais pas marquer. Bon, alors voilà, ok. Bon, je vais jouer guitare. Bon, maintenant, il y a Caroline Harper, responsable de développement à l'étranger. Elle a fait beaucoup de recherches pendant 25 ans sur les normes sociaux. Cassia Berterman, elle est responsable de résultats à Girl Hub à Rwanda. Elle fait la recherche et l'éducation concernant la communication sociale. Et finalement, professeur Hazel Barrett de l'Université de Coventry, qui est aussi responsable pour le Centre de justice sociale et la société. Et elle est intéressée dans le développement en Afrique sous-saharienne. Alors, si vous voulez entendre dans les...
For French. So those are the channels, one for English and two for French. The way, okay, we'll do it the other way around. So we'll have one for French and two for English. So that's one for French, two for English. So what we'll do, we'll ask each of our panel to briefly introduce their talk. I'm then going to turn to two respondents, then if we've got time I'll open it up for question and answer sessions. We will finish strictly at 11:40 because we do need to get back to the plenary session for the high-level session. So first of all, Andrew.
Thank you. I'm going to try to make this mic work. I'm pleased to be here with you to give you some sense of where we think the measurement process on child marriage has been and where it needs to go. So if I can have the presentation up. Okay. So what do we know? As many of you may have heard, we did the systematic review a couple of years ago, and from that we know that there are definitely some effective solutions. And we have some that work sometimes. So life skills mobilization work sometimes, but they are usually not operating at scale. We also have other interventions that are operating on scale. Some of them are effective, like girls' education. We know, we have evidence on that. Some of them are sometimes effective in some circumstances, such as cash incentives and so forth. And some of them might be effective, but we haven't evaluated them for the purposes of delaying marriage, and we probably should, and that would be mass communications. And some of them, at least the evidence so far, and Tuar is sitting right here, legislation on its own does not seem to be effective, and we need to do more. So going forward, we need to figure out what is it that can operate at scale and how do we measure it. What have we been measuring so far? Well, our current measures of success at the program level, that's where most of our interventions have been. At the individual level, we generally tend to look at individual outcomes, which is a good thing because we should be looking at outcomes. And the way we have been measuring change has been whether there's change in knowledge or attitudes and behavior, either of parents, of girls, legislators, leaders, and so forth. We have also been measuring whether individual girls are marrying later because of participation in a particular program. Sometimes we compare them to girls who are not in a program, and that's a better evaluation, but not always. At the community or the national level, we have been measuring what are basically outputs rather than outcomes. So number of communities that committed to not marrying later, which is not an outcome really, it's an output. Similarly, changes in legislation, it's an output. And at the population level, we measure, and UNICEF this morning showed data of the longer term trends at the population of the rates of child marriage among 20 through 24-year-olds or 20 through 49-year-olds and so forth. And more, we are also starting to measure the actual numbers, so the burden of child marriage and not just the prevalence. The problem is we don't measure much that's in between these two things, and really it's at this level that has to accumulate to get to that population level, and that's where the missing picture on measurement for child marriage is. And part of the issue is, what is it that we would measure in the middle that would let us know what's going on? And what I'm proposing today is that we look at two things. We look at medium-term effects and really figure out whether we want to measure them at input, output, or outcome level. We cannot be looking for impact in the short term. And by medium term, I'm looking at about 5 years, let's say 3 to 5 years. And that we consider what thresholds we might want to achieve in the cumulative individual or community level effects that would lead to the kind of population change that we're looking at. So let me propose a few ideas. Measuring success in the medium term for, let's say, 1 to 5 years. We can measure inputs, and we talked about some of those inputs this morning in the panel. So things like whether there's a post-2015 indicator. To me, that is an input. Whether resources are being committed, that is an input, because that's what we're going to take to move things forward. Yeah? Similarly, policy frameworks and action plans are inputs at this point if we want to move forward. Then we can look at outputs, and we should be looking at those at the national level. We can look at one very good measure of success within a 1 to 5 year period would be how many programs are operating at scale in a country that are addressing child marriage. Another really good output would be what expertise and capacity has expanded in a country to address child marriage within 1 to 5 years to address it at scale. That would be a good measure. But at the end of the day, we're not making progress unless we're measuring what's happening to girls and families, because the progress is going to come from there. And at the local level, therefore, I suggest that we look at some thresholds. We look at the percentage in a community of girls 11 to 14 who are attending school. We look at the percentage of parents with aspirations for their daughters to marry them later or to have a life that is beyond what they have been having. We look at a threshold of percentage of women 20 through 24 in the labor force, because that gives us a signal whether it is a society, it is a community where women have a chance to progress further. And I'm sure that there are other skills, opportunities, and aspirations that many of us might be able to come up with, measures of percentage of girls with self-efficacy, self-confidence, other outcome measures that we can achieve within a 3 to 5 year period, but we need to accumulate them. Thank you.
So, Francesca, you can talk to us about measuring social norms.
Right. Okay. So, whoops, next one. So, when we began working on harmful practices, it became very clear to us very quickly that social norms was fundamental. And over the course of the last few years, we've tried really hard to come up, working with academics, working with practitioners, and listening particularly to what's happening in communities, come up with an operational definition of social norms, because unless we know exactly what we're talking about, it's very hard to measure. We have to have clarity on what we're measuring. This slide and the next slide is an appetizer. You can actually read some 6 pages only in this publication, which is in the back, and you can have more fun reading it calmly. But what we basically find extremely useful is this diagnostic, which basically says a social norm is, something is a social norm if if you see people around you engaging in that behavior and you're conditioned by that behavior. And something is a social norm if you feel that other people around you want you to engage in that behavior. So there's a social obligation. So those are 2 things we can objectively measure. Therefore, when we're looking at social norms, the parameters of measurement have to go beyond the ones that we traditionally measure and we have a lot of data on, which are prevalence. In the case of female genital mutilation, cutting, and child marriage, we have pretty decent data. We saw it yesterday. We saw it this morning. We have data on prevalence. For female genital mutilation cutting, we have data on attitudes. And we saw, and we know very clearly that a lot of people don't support the practice, but still engage in the practice. And we know how important that is in action. What we need to get a stronger sense of is how many people believe that it's happening around them, and is it consistent with reality? Is that something that is driving their behavior? And also, and most important, how many people and to what degree do they feel the social obligation? As the social obligation changes over time, as people begin to question that social obligation, that's something that you can track, and it'll happen before they actually change their behavior. Ultimately, really, this is what we're interested in. We're interested in seeing the social change process. We know that that social change process that leads to a new social norm, more and more, and let me emphasize that, we're thinking about casting the whole work not so much as changing the harmful norm, but in fact of promoting a positive new norm, where there are already people in the society that want something better for themselves and for their communities. It's creating the movement, supporting the movement for that new norm to happen. It's a positive way of looking at it. And the measurement, we know that there are different processes there's a process of discussion and dialogue that creates individual and collective empowerment, and you can measure that. Who talks about it? What do they say? How much do they talk about it? Do the women talk? Do the girls talk? Do the boys talk? Do they talk with each other? How do they talk about the issues? That's the first arrow. There's a process of individual change that then also interacts with the collective change. We can measure all those things. Or more importantly, we can support local measurement, which in itself becomes an empowering mechanism. So let me just give you one example. In many of the work of the programs that we support, not just we UNICEF, we, the collective we support, there are volunteers or community workers in the communities that are engaging in discussions. There are reporters, there are people that are, in community radios and so on that are engaging in discussions. There are discussions going on at national level. The community workers, for example, can be tracking along this continuum some very simple markers. Is the discussion happening? Or is everybody discussing, or is it still just the elders, for example, or just the women? Are people starting to question? Are people starting to expect people to change or to act differently? And ultimately, are people's obligations, social obligations, changing over time? And by just creating those trackers, the very people who are supporting those conversations become more aware and more conscious of the process that they're supporting, and everyone can begin to track all of these, the change process in a more deliberate way. So we don't have to do tremendous amount of new surveys. We've got the ways already to measure. We just have to use them better, or have them use them better. Thank you.
Francesca, thank you very much. So, Caroline, now you're going to talk to us about measuring empowerment and transformation in the post-2015 agenda.
So I should say that this work has been carried out with two of my colleagues here. Kaiko from the OECD, we've worked together on this piece of work, and Grace is also here from Uganda, and we've been working with Grace on many issues around discriminatory norms. The main thrust for our research at ODI is that early marriage is an outcome of low levels of empowerment more generally, and therefore multiple drivers of discriminatory social norms. So action on early marriage has to be about girls' and women's empowerment more broadly. And we've undertaken research in many countries, in Vietnam, Ethiopia, Nepal, and Uganda. And this has shown that it's these factors which underpin girls' lack of empowerment. These factors on the right here, amongst others. And therefore their lack of choice in marriage. Our work in Ethiopia, for example, has focused on communities where young girls are married very early and sent to the Middle East to work in domestic work, but they're divorced within 2 or 3 months by their parents in order that the remittances come home to their parents. And the girls honor is preserved by being married before she migrates. Sometimes they go willingly, sometimes they're the instigators, sometimes they're reluctant to go. The contexts are all different. But the fact is that they are powerless in many ways to make choices about their life course. And we found this in many other countries. In Vietnam, only 4% of the Hmong girls that we work with go into secondary school in a country where girls in secondary school exceed boys in secondary school. And the reason for that is because they have very few opportunities. Their parents don't see the point of secondary school for them and don't want them to go to secondary school, so they keep them at home and they marry them very early. So it's action to address this broader range of discriminatory practices and attitudes that will end early marriage. It's action which will raise the status of girls in the eyes of their parents and community and empower them in a range of capabilities. And it's important that countries can be held to account for progress in taking this action and addressing gender discriminatory norms. Just put on my glasses, it'll be easier. And it's important there's also a renewed focus on measuring changes in social norms as the drivers of discrimination, such as attitudes towards women and violence, rather than just focusing on measuring the outcomes of discrimination, such as indeed early marriage itself. So ODI and the OECD have built on the SIGI index, which is a measurement of underlying discrimination against women in over 100 countries, to identify measurement areas which illustrate women's empowerment and social transformation, and which... Okay, sorry, speaking too fast. And which can be incorporated into the post-2015 agenda. Commonly, governments and policy actors have held that social norms are too complicated to measure progress against, and that data is not available. But we actually can test this, and the paper that you'll find at the back of the room actually gives examples of where data can be found. There's much more data available now than when the original MDGs were drawn up. So we suggest 6 measurement areas for which data is available in more than 80 developing countries, and which would indicate progress in girls' empowerment and ultimately lead to positive outcomes, including delays in early marriage. And ideally, for each measurement area, there should be indicators on legal frameworks, on prevalence, and on attitudes. This is to show social transformation. Any one of these areas on its own, such as legal, national legal changes, won't illustrate necessarily that there's change at a local level, but a combination of those 3 areas will illustrate change. So to take women's participation in political and civic life, indicators would be legislation on women's political participation, the proportion of women in parliament or local government, and the proportion of voters who think men make better political leaders than women. That is legislation, attitudes, and prevalence. There are many attitudinal surveys, for example, which measure the last indicator. For freedom from violence, national laws on violence against women, prevalence of domestic violence, and the percentage of women and men who justify domestic violence under certain circumstances. That data is available in more than 80 developing countries. Even difficult areas are making progress. Very importantly, time use has long been seen as too difficult to measure, the amount of time that women and girls put particularly into domestic labor. But in 80 countries now, we can measure the female-to-male ratio of average time devoted to household chores and total workload, paid and unpaid. So we need to measure these 3 different areas, and we are suggesting that we can actually do that. It's not perfect, but we can do it in more than 80 developing countries. This data does exist now. We should use it. And as data evolves and improves, so will our knowledge on social norms. By the time we approach 2030, more data sources will be available to deepen and advance the analysis of social norm change. And importantly, if we monitor progress, we will also know which countries are and which countries are not seriously addressing girls' human rights. More detail of all of those suggested indicators and the data sources available at the back of the room in the paper on this.
But what we do need are the indicators and measures to actually know whether it's happening. So thank you very much, Caroline, for that. So Kessia, you're going to talk to us about collecting data on empowerment and changes in attitudes, innovations and ethics. Over to you.
So I'm going to focus exclusively on the methodology side and how we collect all of this interesting information. At Girl Hub, we work to equip and empower 10 to 19-year-old girls. But as you can imagine, conducting research with young girls is very challenging. They might be shy and reluctant to speak and to share their stories and their experiences. So I'm just going to briefly talk you through 3 different approaches that we use to help collect girls' voices in what we do. The first is SenseMaker. And SenseMaker is a story collection methodology, and it works very simply. We go into the community and we ask girls to share a story, any story that they like. And then we ask them to tell us what the story is about. And for them to tell us what the story is about, we use things like this triad that you see behind me, where the girl puts 1 dot in the triangle, and in this particular example we have skills, confidence, and social connections. And the girl puts 1 dot in the triangle, and then we aggregate all of the responses across thousands of different respondents, and we can see some really interesting patterns emerge. And this really helps to reduce bias as well, because the girl herself is telling us what the story is about. In Ethiopia and Rwanda, we've used this with a mixed methodology with quantitative survey and SenseMaker together. The second approach that I'd like to talk about is talking about how do you collect information at large scale. In Rwanda, we are working with the Ministry of Health and with DFID on the 12 Plus program. And this is a program for 10 to 12-year-old girls. And we're already at national scale in year 1. We have 12,000 girls, and we'll move to 100,000 girls within 3 years. But how do you collect data for such a large amount of girls? So we're working with the Ministry of Health to develop a mobile app for smartphones that the mentors will use to collect routine data. This is absolutely critical so that we can look at real-time data. We can make decisions about what's happening in the program across large geographies and large numbers of girls. The third area to talk about is the Girl Research Unit. And this is a group of young women that we have trained in Rwanda. And they're trained in qualitative research techniques. The thinking behind this is who better to collect information about young girls than young women themselves. But I would like to have the Girl Research Unit themselves tell you what the Girl Research Unit is all about. Could I have the video, please?
GRU is the Girl Research Unit, and is a group of 6 young women that has been initiated and trained by Girl Hub Rwanda. We focus on caritative research, and we work to become professional researchers.
We trained how to do a discussion guide, how to write a proposal based on the objective you have, how to use different methodologies in doing research, like using workshop, using interview, depth interview, using intercept, using ethnography, and using desk research, which can help you to get more information. And another thing that we trained in GRU is how you can easily recruit girls, how you can approach girls and work with them. I have learned how you can make a good environment for your respondent. When it's young, or because they are focusing on girls, you have to make more energizers to make the girls to come with more energy and to feel free to talk.
We are Rwandans, and also we have experience about Rwandan girls' lives, and also we understand our culture.
The reason why I joined GRU is because I'm curious and I want to know more about girls in Rwanda, to know their lives, to know the problem they face in their life, to know more about what they do. so that I can build my knowledge and my skills about girls in Rwanda.
Research unit, I also just want to note that all of the research that they have done has been enormously useful for us. And it's not just a training program on the side, but it's actual data that we do use in our real lives. Just to finish, what is the most effective way to measure change? We're still learning, but I think that these approaches have been very useful for us and have enabled us to really get the voice of the girl at every level.
I thought that was really interesting, actually, and the use of technology in particular, I think, is something that we all need to do a lot more of in all our work. So finally, Hazel, Professor Hazel Barrett will be talking to us about how to measure community-based behaviour change.
Just keep talking. Okay. The Replace project is an EU-funded project by the Daphne 3 programme. And it's a project which is investigating the belief systems and the social norms that support the continuation of FGMC amongst African practicing communities in the European Union. The main aim of the project is to understand the barriers to behavioural change and the mechanisms for achieving social norm transformation. If you want to know more about the project, there is a leaflet at the back of the room. Please feel free to pick one up and contact me if you wish to. The Replace project has found that the links between social norms, the community and individual agency are highly complex and varied. In all our research communities, we found that communities were pivotal in enforcing FGMC. With individuals or families who choose not to perform FGMC being constrained and often overruled by the community in having their daughters cut. But whilst communities are enforcing social norms, we believe in Replace that communities can also be a force for change. We have found in our research that the communities we've been working with across 5 different countries in the European Union are at different stages of readiness to end FGMC. And we want to harness that readiness to change to end the practice. Replace is evaluating a new index to assess community readiness to end FGMC. The index scores communities on 6 themes or dimensions, as shown here. These are then converted into a community readiness to change stage. And we have identified 9 stages, and these range from stage 1, where the community awareness of the issues associated with the ending of FGMC is low or non-existent, to stage 9, where community ownership where there is community ownership and a high level of community desire to end FGMC. Clearly, as communities move through these 9 stages, the balance of power between the community norms and individual agency changes, with individual agency becoming more powerful as a community becomes more ready to replace its social norms. The index is currently being evaluated, and we have promising results. And I want to share with you some examples of this index in practice. In Sicily, for example, we have assessed the readiness to change of the Ethiopian and Eritrean community. And we've assessed that community to be at a very low level of readiness to change. In fact, we've put them into stage 2 of community denial and resistance. This is not surprising, as the community is transient and unstable, as these are very often people who have just entered the European Union off boats or by other means. We have therefore implemented a project to form community groups within those migrant groups, so that we can raise the awareness of the health impacts of FGMC, as well as inform them of the legal issues associated with FGMC in the European Union. In London, we have scored the Somali and Sudanese communities at stage 3, i.e. vague community awareness, where many people have concerns, but there is no community motivation. In other words, this half of the room have some small motivation to end FGM, but are frightened to do so because the people on the other side of the room are going to force it upon them, or they'll be ostracized or bullied. So we have put in place communication interventions, speakeasies for young people, help with intergender and intergenerational dialogue. In the Netherlands, we've been working with the Somali community, and we have scored them at stage 4, the pre-planning stage, where there is recognition that something has to be done, but efforts to end FGMC lack focus. And what we have found here is that Quranic teachers have come up to us, and they are beginning to question the religious imperative of undertaking FGMC, but they lack the confidence to speak out. We are therefore putting in place a workshop with a booklet and DVD concerning FGMC and Islam, in which we are using Quranic teachers from Rotterdam University. This is giving these Quranic teachers, both men and women, the confidence and, more importantly, the evidence to speak out against FGMC within their communities. In each of these cases, the intervention has been tailored to the community readiness to change, and therefore has a better chance of success. The index is easy and simple to use and requires few resources. Thus, the index, in our view, has 3 applications. First, to determine the stage of readiness of a community to end FGMC, to ensure that the interventions that we put in place are appropriately targeted to achieve maximum effectiveness. Secondly, to monitor and evaluate how community norms are changing over time as a result of specific campaigns or interventions to FGMC. And thirdly, maybe in resource-strapped communities, this index could be a proxy for changes within FGM in the community. To conclude, communities, in our view, are the key link between social norms and individual agency. They are thus pivotal in ending FGMC. We must remember, however, that communities are formed of individuals and families. Communities are at different stages of readiness to change, and therefore one size fits all is not going to work. We hope that this index, which is proving so useful in the EU, can be rolled out to other FGM-affected communities to help in our fight to end FGMC in a generation. Thank you.
Hey, Hazel, thank you very much. You can hear me now at last. Thank you very much for that. So I'm just all going to put you on notice now that we're just going to have 2 respondents who are going to talk, I hope, about something which is dear to my heart, about linking evidence into policy and the context in terms of the discussions they've heard today in their own context. And that's Professor Grace Bantebia, who's Professor of the School of Women and Gender Studies in Makerere University in Uganda. And then I'll turn to Dr. Priya Nanda, who is at the South Asia Regional Office of the International Centre for Research on Women in India. And then I hope we'll have a bit of time to open it up for any comments or questions. But first of all, Grace.
Thank you very much. I'll share with you 2 points based on the Uganda study by ODI in relation to child marriage. From this study, we now know that we need to generate more data and measure and have indicators regarding the social norms in order to map out the changes that are transformative to the lives of girls and women. In our study, the qualitative study, we found that there are changes that are taking place in the marriage practices. Girls are now able to choose their partners as opposed to their grandmothers and mothers. We also found that the value of girls' education had also increased. But we need more information on how, when, and why, and the changes are happening, are taking place in these communities. The second point is on the evidence. Once we do map out and have indicators on these social norms regarding the changes that are taking place, we can use these indicators through policy making processes. For instance, for Uganda, using the Uganda Demographic and Health Survey data and population studies and also qualitative data, the government is using this data to frame and develop a policy on girls going back to school after pregnancy. So it is possible to change. Thank you.
Grace, thank you. Priya.
Thank you. This was an excellent panel. In the light? Okay. Thank you. This was an excellent panel, and I was asked to respond in a minute around things research that ICRW has done that would be about connecting the evidence to action. I wanted to actually just talk very briefly about 2 or 3 things. One is that we are currently evaluating a conditional cash transfer program that the government of Haryana in India had started in 1994, and it goes to the points that Anju had talked about earlier, that is one of the strategies where we think it's somewhat effective. We don't have enough evidence, and those findings, the first stage findings are out, and I'll be sharing it in the spotlight session this afternoon to say that there is an effect of CCTs on girls' educational attainment, but in terms of some of the other issues that the panelists have been talking about around changing attitudes and aspirations, that's where some of the data is lacking, and that's where we really need to refine our measurement. And the second thing is about the fact that we have been able to influence through the research we have done around a program that MacArthur Foundation has been funding us in India called the Gender Equity Movement in Schools. What we have been able to influence from the evidence is to have curricula for gender transformative learning in the national curriculum, the national educational curriculum in India, and I think that's a big achievement. So in terms of one research and one operational research study working at scale now, but also how it has been able to mainstream and scale up findings to influence the national curriculum for all kids 12 to 14 in India, and I think that's a big achievement. Thank you.
Priya, thank you. So we've heard about threshold effects, measuring obligations, social institutions and gender index, community readiness to change index, and sense maker and use of mobile phone apps. So there's a wide range of things we've heard about today. So I'm going to open it up now for 1 or 2 questions or comments. I mean, you don't have to ask a question, you can comment, and this can be a conversation between you. So I'm going to take 2 to start with, in the front and in the second row.
Thank you. So my name is Keiko Nowacka. I'm from the OECD Development Center, and with Caroline we've worked a lot on the social institutions and gender index. And I just want to stress the importance of investing in national statistical capacities. And with Grace, we also have this country pilot of the SIGI. Sorry. I'm Australian, I speak very quickly, but I will slow down. So we have this country study where we're working with the National Statistical Office on social norm indicators, and we're adapting our framework for the country, for Uganda, with great people like Grace, where we identify social norms that are prevalent in that country, and we look and do a cross-regional study. And using that kind of information, we're then able to inform a post-2015 process, which we're very much engaged with also, so with Caroline. So I just want to talk about the importance of investing in national statistical offices. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm just going to take one last comment or question. We've got to finish at 11:30, so...
Yeah, my name is Ashok Dyalchand. I'm from India. And, you know, one of the things that the literature on social norms says is that the unit of change is society, community, not individuals. It's not the tipping point that large number of individuals change their behavior and then we call that a social change. So going by Dr. Francesca's definition, I would say the number of communities that have been able to implement descriptive and injunctive norms. And Madam, I'd like to ask you, when you talk about community awareness, community belief systems, community practices, aren't we talking at an individual level? Or are we still talking about accumulation of individuals resulting in a social norm?
And we were talking about that last night, and that's a fantastically interesting question, which I'm going to ask you, I'm afraid, to carry on outside of the room, because we do have to wrap up, because I'm being looked at very fiercely here, that we have to wrap up. So let me just finish, before I thank our panel and ask you to give them some thanks, just a reflection. I mean, we've come to this event because we know what we want to do. We know some of the how, but we're never really going to know exactly the how unless we can measure it. And I very much agree with our colleague from the OECD Development Centre that what we need is a data revolution. We need to build the capacity so we can measure the data, but also we need to bring the data to life and actually make communities, citizens, to engage with that data with their government so that they can... Sorry? No, absolutely. No, I agree with you entirely. And that's all part of the data revolution. So can I just thank our 5 panelists, and can I invite you to thank our 5 panelists for sharing their thoughts and their experiences and their research. And please take away after this event your thoughts and continue this conversation throughout the rest of the day and beyond. So please, can we show our thanks to our 5 panelists?